Europe wants to deny at all times. There's white people that are super fucking poor, like who are exposed to numerous amounts of violence. So it's like, why are we like? And once again, we're falling on that trap of romanticizing the global south of this thing that we need to save. And like a lot of people, and that's completely fine. Like a lot of people from the diaspora are like, I'm gonna quit myself and take what is for me, and I'm gonna take it back. Like, you do that, that's fine. But there's also like a fight to fight here, because not everything is solved here. Like trans women die all the fucking time. Like the tension exists. Like all these forms of there's like, and like I said, like it is like a symptom of a disease. Like that is, and yeah, and that means that we have to counter it in different ways, and it might look different. But I think it's like yeah, like a similar fight and not prioritizing one fight over the other.
Yeah, I mean, and I always like, you know, being in so-called Australia and the global north, global south thing. It's just like, what like, like I don't, you know, I don't talk in these terms very often, like, at all really. But yeah, because like the struggle of First Nations people, where does that fit in those ideas? I don't understand. You know, so yeah.
Yes. I feel, okay, so I do spend almost 40% of my time outside the UK, but I'm based here, like this is my base.
Yeah.
And I do think there is a relevance to us being anywhere in the world, and there is relevance to the movement of bodies across borders, to our struggles. And I think this is also to do with the fact that if we really want to address any type of oppression, we really need to get rid of borders, because they've failed. Borders have created ideologies around nationalism, which control our bodies, whether LGBT identified or whether people who don't necessarily identify as LGBT, and even heterosexuals. So I think there is a relevance to disturbing borders, and I do at this stage. I think in my work, I think it should become a first priority across transnationally, dismantling borders, because in addition to the nationalism, it also comes with differential status for different countries. We have the first world and the third world, and it's about time to move beyond this nationalist rhetoric. It's about time also to move beyond this the us and the them, but not in a way that also erases our material realities, not in a way that erases the differential historical processes we went through to be where we are now at the moment. So I feel, I mean, there is an issue around positionality, definitely, that we all need to think about and consider when we do work anywhere in the world. And I do know, I mean, I came here as a student. It was not easy to stay. Immigration, Theresa May came to power just as I was applying for my post-study work visa. You know, and all of these things. So it has not been easy, and I cannot call it a privilege being here. And if anything, I'm not happy being here, and maybe at some point I'll leave. But the point I'm trying to make actually now is we really need to start addressing the problems that borders create and stop talking about the minor issues. And zooming out and just looking at how roots of oppression are affecting our lives and what roots of oppression we need to be getting rid of.
So, thank you. I mean, I would also echo the sentiments of just how complicated it is in terms of tracing my own migration history, if you like, through the lens of the Commonwealth, quite specifically, because you know, I can trace my ethnicity back to Sri Lanka, which obviously is a former part of, well, it's part of the Commonwealth, but former colony. But of course, I grew up in Australia, which as a migrant. So then I moved somewhere, which obviously is dispossessed land of the First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who existed there. And so that occupies a very different position that I had, you know, as a relatively privileged migrant in that space. And then I was actually born in London, and so, you know, coming back, as if I have any connection here. You know, even though I have family here, and I think for lots of diasporas, this continues to be a real knotted challenge to think through, you know, questions of belonging, you know, where is home, where do you belong, these sorts of things are really quite difficult to navigate. And I often think that one of the biggest problems, and I completely agree with this idea of kind of dismantling you know, borders as kind of the sites of so much violence, but also to think about how the nature of migration, and certainly the migrations that I've been a part of, have created these hierarchies over good migrants, bad migrants, better migrants, worse migrants, even within your own ethnic communities. So I think about this primarily in relation to my own family, who are Sri Lankan Tamil, who didn't flee directly in the context of persecution, so I won't label them in the sense of being refugees, even though that was obviously part of that context in which they left. But for people who, for example, come to Australia by boat seeking asylum, for those who are familiar, Australia has one of the most elaborated and brutal systems of detention in the world. It interdicts vessels and then sends them to effectively concentration camps in Manus and Papua New Guinea, where they are still, a number of people remain in detention 6 years on from the reopening of the centres. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in conversations with my family is, you know, people saying, well, how do you know they're real refugees, yeah? And but then I say, but they're coming from the same space that we left, I mean, decades ago, but also it's almost like this sense in which there's both a sense of like, you know, cultural amnesia in some ways, but also a sense in which we've had to work to get here, and they've kind of not. And obviously it's a very insidious rhetoric, but it plays out enormously well politically. And you see this very well done in Australia. We've just had an election, and you know, people assumed that the incumbent government would lose. It's a Conservative government. And yet they held on to power. And part of that is because of A, how toxic the migration politics is in Australia, but also because a lot of those migrant communities, ethnic migrant communities, support these very policies and support these very you know, governments in what they do. And this is a very difficult space, and it's enormously complex because you want to challenge that, but people refuse to kind of get into that understanding, and they'll say, yeah, we get it, there is racism. You know, it's almost like they'll accept that, yes, you know, they are racist, and yet still vote for them. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is one of the really interesting things for me that I really struggle with, is that, you know, my family, you know, they'll say, yeah, we agree, yeah, that is racist, or they are racist, and we'll still literally vote. You know, and it's, and I don't know if any of you have been watching Years and Years, which is the BBC drama set in Manchester, but there is a scene where there's a gay couple, and one of them is British, and his partner has fled and sought asylum, and you know, he is basically you know, his whole life is problematized by the existence of a literal border, right? Like his intimacy is cut down, it's you know, destroyed, and yet he votes for the party that establishes and supports this very system that is actually destroying him quite literally, and he's white. So this is, you know, this is already kind of complicated, but you know, for me, these are the things that I really struggle with, and actually I think these sorts of questions around how we relate to where we're from and migration require us to confront this further and really challenge this further, and I don't know how to do that. I mean, I still struggle with that a lot, but yeah, sorry, that was a very long-winded way.
No, thank you.
I was gonna say that, yeah, like that's something that we center a lot on the work that we do in the grassroots organizing that we do of unlearning these things. So like we literally give like, we've had like 6-hour trainings on a Sunday, but it's literally like to break these things down of like, what does that mean when you say those things? So like literally like, it's been like a year's work of being like, it's okay to claim benefits, like saying like really naming what the hostile environment does, like talking about how different migration stories mean different things, and like holding and being accountable to the privilege that we have So I think that work can be done. It's just like about just like coming together and be like, okay, we're gonna demystify these things. And it literally was as basic as like, we're gonna look at a paper and this is what it says about migrants and this is what the numbers say. So like it was the first time that they were like, oh wow, okay, we're not leeches, we're literally